Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me at the back of the room? Everyone hear me okay? Lovely stuff. So, good morning and welcome to the first event at this year's Conservative Party conference from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. It's an absolute delight today to be partnering with our good friends at the Mines Advisory Group on this really important and timely discussion on UK security and preventing conflicts globally. My name's Ryan Baldry and I'm Senior Communications Manager at CGP. The humanitarian consequences of the ongoing war in Ukraine are stark reminders of the wide-ranging international impacts of conflict. Unfortunately, over 100 places around the world are currently experiencing active armed conflicts, including in countries that are British overseas territories and UK allies and trading partners. At the Coalition for Global Prosperity, we exist to champion Britain as a global development superpower and believe that an effective development budget, alongside an active diplomatic and defence strategy, keeps Britain at the heart of saving lives, alleviating poverty, and bringing freedom, security, and prosperity to those who need it most. On our panel today, I'm very pleased to be joined by the Right Honourable Alistair Burt, former Member of Parliament and Minister at both the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development. James Sunderland MP, Member of Parliament for Bracknell since 2019, and has also served in the British Army in a variety of operations worldwide, retiring at the rank of Colonel before standing for Parliament. I'm also joined by Jai Singh Sohal, who also from the British Army as a veteran, works in strategic communications. He served abroad on operations against ISIS and during the COVID pandemic. I'm also joined by Josephine Dresser, Director of Policy and Strategic Partnerships at MAG, having previously held roles as Country Director in both Myanmar and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'm very glad I got that one out all in one. So, I'll just start with some questions so that the panellists can introduce themselves and their thoughts. So, Alistair, coming to you first, what are the best tools at our disposal for preventing conflicts globally from what you've seen in your time at DFID and also the FCO?
Thanks very much, Ryan, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see such a crowd of people to discuss this. The short answer to my question isn't, I suppose, terribly good. I think we have real difficulties now in dealing with a conflict-ridden world, and I think there are things that can be done that will mitigate some of the difficulties, but I don't think they'll end them. The end of a post-war consensus, the breakdown of great international diplomacy, or the near breakdown of great international diplomacy, when the UN Security Council can neither stop wars happening nor actually end them when they're ongoing, means that more people are subject to the crises of conflict, as we've just heard. There is also a greater sense of lawlessness. By that I mean more people prepared to challenge the established status quo in states, rendering some of them near impossible to govern, and into the empty space that such lack of authority creates step non-state actors, usually malevolent. And the three great drivers of conflict, men, almost exclusively men, money and power, are driving a process of conflict which is extremely difficult to control. There are things that we can do and we should be doing, and we must continue to try to do as best we can, because otherwise it's a counsel of despair. I do believe diplomacy has its merits. There are things that can be done in some early stages of conflict to support countries as best as possible, to mitigate the effects of lawlessness and make sure that people are able to survive, to assist the political institutions, whatever they may be, to try and provide the basis of some sort of stabilisation going forward, and the government's conflict stabilisation work, which it's been patiently doing over many years, which must be done in company with others because individual intervention is now extremely difficult, does provide some basis for going forward. So Diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, track 2 has its benefit. We've seen some evidence in recent times of areas where there could be significant tension and conflict beginning to ease. Iran's discussions with its neighbours, always on Iran's terms rather than anybody else's, which may not be comfortable, but eases the tension in the Middle East, is something to watch as its neighbours decide that they don't want a conflict in that region. But then you turn to East Africa and the misery of Sudan, and you wonder what interests are there that would drive an end of a conflict. If it's in someone's best interest to have conflict rather than not, then conflict tends to arise. We tend to work in this country and in many Western liberal countries on the basis that most people desire peace and security in order to go forward. Most people do, but many leaders do not, and conflict suits them, war economies suit them, they make money out of them. Look at Yemen, and ultimately, if you're brutal enough, long enough, you win. Ask Assad in Syria. So it's not a great picture, but it does mean that those who are engaged in efforts to mitigate conflict make sure that bullies don't have the means to overrun other countries, make sure other countries have the means to defend themselves. As we've seen in Ukraine, a whole mixture of things, but I'm afraid the elimination of conflict, the hoped for settlement sort of post the great disasters of the 20th century, seems to me as far away as ever.
Thank you. And just James, I'd just like to come to you if I can, and from your experience in the armed forces and also your time in Parliament, what implications do conflicts overseas have for people here in the UK? Because to a lot of people, a conflict abroad can seem so far away when you're also facing challenges at home. But what are some of those impacts that you can feel in the UK?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I mean, there's lots in that, and not an easy question to answer. But what I would say, what springs to mind straight away is this element of discretionary and non-discretionary. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the UK now, we're clearly a global power, but not to the same extent that we were. Our interests globally have shrunk because we're no longer controlling a quarter of the globe. But my point is this: we're still a global power. We've still got a seat on the UN Security Council. We are a leading edge of NATO, now 32 countries. So we've got a clear role, in my view, to look after our interests worldwide, and also to look after allies as part of a coalition. But in terms of whether we intervene or not, that's discretionary, non-discretionary. I would argue that defence of the realm, which is one of our key defence tasks, encompasses many things. It also includes protection of UK citizens, UK residents, UK overseas territories. It includes protection of trade. It includes humanitarian assistance where needed. So there are many reasons why the UK might decide to intervene globally. And I'm talking hard power. And let's not forget soft power. But I think to answer your question directly, it's about government policy. You know, what is our policy towards a particular part of the world? Do we need to intervene? We've made the decision to intervene in Ukraine, rightly so. We've got interests elsewhere as well. But ultimately, the extent to which we intervene is down to the ability of our government to intervene. It's about the forces we hold at readiness. It's about what effects we can bring to bear. And of course, it's also about whether we need boots on the ground, which is, in my view, the highest state of intervention, putting boots on the ground. And whether we can translate that enough to the British people, of course we have to, if we make the decision to put boots on the ground. So again, to answer your question, it's discretionary against non-discretionary.
Thank you. And Josephine, I'd like to turn to you now, if I could, and ask about Mag's work in helping to prevent conflict, because obviously the name's the Mines Advisory Group, but there's a lot of work around conflict prevention that you do as well. So I was just wondering if you'd be able to talk about your work and Mag's wider work in the preventing the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which, as Alistair said, is one of those sort of causes behind conflict and one of the key drivers.
Yes, thank you, absolutely. I think, first of all, yes, it is important to emphasise that although we are known as the Mines Advisory Group, that we have been working on weapons and ammunition related issues for just coming up to the last 20 years. So it is actually a very established part of our work. So you asked about countering proliferation, and that's certainly one aspect of it. So there's diversion prevention. There is also preventing misuse, which I'll come back to. But the core part of our work is working with governments and security sector actors, and that's mainly in developing countries and those either kind of suffering from armed violence or recovering from conflict. That's across Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, the Asia-Pacific region, and also the Middle East. The core activities there's a lot of destruction of weapons and ammunition, improvements to infrastructure or provision of infrastructure, but essentially alongside that is training and putting in place the processes that are needed to build a culture of accountability and transparency among the actors that we're working with. And all of this is a kind of a cornerstone to aiming to prevent armed violence, which, like localised armed violence is often, the first step towards conflict. When I talked about processes, for example, putting in place simple measures like proper record-keeping systems, often moving those from paper-based systems to proper digitalised systems, are really important to be able to identify the point of diversion, so where weapons have gone from being legally held to being illicit, so that you can understand it and then start to mitigate the reasons that they're being diverted. Weapons destruction, it's essential in itself just to reduce the number of firearms that any security force might be holding and dealing with if they've got too many, particularly in a developing country, or if they're undergoing a security sector reform process. It's just much harder to manage them in an accountable way. It's especially important to make sure there's destruction of seized, confiscated and surrendered weapons, because those are often the ones that you see reappearing on the illegal market time and time again. So they'll be seized and then they'll reappear. Going from there to the misuse side of it, obviously in a lot of the context that we're working in, people are going to have weapons, so we at the very least need to encourage them to store them safely away from children. So that's not necessarily an appropriate conversation to be having in every context, but sometimes it is. We also have to recognise the importance of, I've already mentioned accountability and good governance among security sector actors, because obviously they also can be the agents of armed violence themselves. We know that there are human rights abuses and issues with security forces in many of the countries that we work in, and that can't always be a reason to disengage. We've got to find ways to kind of build the confidence and build that good governance amongst those actors, because to fill those gaps that Alistair referred to, the spaces in which malign actors might be moving, you have to have trusted security forces. You have to have security forces that the population is willing to work with. And I think it's also just important to mention briefly, although it's not to do with proliferation, it is an important issue that MAG works to address, is the question of unplanned explosions. They don't happen very often, fortunately, but when they do, they can be catastrophic. So, a couple of the really well-known ones were Congo Brazzaville back in 2012, which caused, I think, upwards of $350 million worth of economic damage, and at least 300 deaths, displacement of about 120,000 people. Lebanon, even worse, of course, that was commercial explosives and not ammunition, but the challenges remain the same, and Lebanon still has not recovered from that incident in 2020. So mitigating the risks of those unplanned explosions is key as well.
I'm shortly going to ask the audience if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask our panel, so do have a little think if there's anything you'd like to pose. But before I do, Jay, I'd like to bring you in if I can and ask, with your experience, and I should have said in the introduction, I guess the media as well as the armed forces, how do you think we can broach this subject of conflict and conflict prevention with the general public? Because, and I guess it's in a similar vein to what I asked James earlier, some conflicts seem so far away and so far removed. How do you think that we can actually get the public and keep the public on side when we're dealing with these situations?
It's a very good question, and I think one I've battled with, as you allude to, in many different guises, both as a former journalist in the Sky Newsroom, in fact, during the Arab uprisings, as well as in uniform when we're looking at either controlling the flow of information into the information environment, or indeed trying to tell our story. And indeed with COVID, that was a good example as well of us trying to tell our story and encourage people, certainly with the behaviours we needed to change. I think it's tough, it's difficult. My experience in the newsroom from the period of the Arab uprising was a lot of fatigue around the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. It became very difficult to report on certainly the repatriations of British service men and women coming back to the UK, and as a news outlet, trying to cover mainstream events and tell the story. It becomes a lot more harder when people are turned off by it. They don't want to be hearing about it. They don't want to be knowing about it, and that has an impact into our politics. But my take on this, as well as my take on conflict generally, is probably best summed up by a motto, if I may use it. It's probably the best motto in the British Army. James might disagree. It's also the motto of my former regiment, the intelligence corps. So manue dot cognito vires. Knowledge gives strength to the arm, and I think certainly whether you're in uniform or not, we need to focus more on the knowledge base. What information is there in the information environment, but also ensuring that knowledge and ensuring that the various elements of information and information flow is both accurate, truthful, and is doing a great service not only to our proponents of UK hard and soft power all over the world, but also to our public, and ensuring that we're making the case for intervention when required, but also making the case for the UK's role on the world stage, and what we can achieve and what we can do. And I, putting on a slightly different guise in uniform, have seen that at play in uniform, working with our American partners in particular, but also with defence engagement trips James and I have undertaken to India, a very core, key strategic partner now and into the future. And they want the Brits there. They want the Brits there because of what we bring, our knowledge base, but also our ability to influence, our ability to create behaviour change and affect change as well. So we bring a lot of tools and capabilities to the table, working with partners. We can't do this alone anymore. But when we're talking to the Americans, they want us there, and they want us to send everything we've got. So there's very much a demand there, and demand signal needs to be met with our capabilities, and that capability might very well come from the soft power elements and the influence elements more often than the hard power parts.
Excellent, thank you. So if I could now start coming to questions. So I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. If you can please keep them brief so we can get through as many people as possible, that'd be really appreciated. So I'm going to ask for roughly, a sentence, but I realise, we'll see how we go. So this gentleman here, Rosie, if I could, Rosie's just going to come to you. And then the lady over there in the pink, if we can. Thank you.
Alistair Campbell, as you probably gather, I'm from Scotland. I'm a great believer in UK as a force for good, and particularly post-Brexit. My question is really focused more on China, which is portrayed in the media as one of the bad guys, and I think they've a lot more to offer in international peace than is generally realised in the British press, so perhaps it's one aimed at. And may also excuse myself and my colleague, we have to leave shortly after this question because we've got to attend a Countryside Alliance event. Thank you.
Okay, and then if I could just take the lady at the end of the row. Thank you.
Thank you. I asked this question very quickly as somebody who's worked in Afghanistan, who led programs with CSSF, worked in Tunisia, worked in Libya with the government. What does the UK government need to do that it's not already doing? What do we need to do differently going forwards? Is it funding more programs, MAG, or does the UK government need to actually take more action? What's that public-private relation look like?
Excellent. So let's start off. James, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts on the China angle, given your background and what the current discussion in Parliament as well. And then if I can pass that to you as well, Alistair.
Sure.
And then we'll come to the partnerships angle afterwards.
Yeah, very briefly, if you listen to certain MPs at the moment, you'd think that our policy towards China was quite confused. I don't think it is, actually. I think our policy towards China is quite clear. And if you work on the assumption that China is not an adversary, it's a competitor, I think government policy falls naturally from that. A quick anecdote, I was, sorry to name drop, I was with the Prime Minister a few weeks ago, and I asked him when he came back from Vilnius how he'd gone on, how he'd found it, and I asked him in particular about Joe Biden, and he said to me that Joe Biden, of all the US politicians that he could name, was probably the one that was most well informed about China. Really experienced politician with China, and his clear view is that China is not necessarily a military threat. Economically, yes, but not military. And I think that's the Chinese way. I think it's. I think they quite like to be almost, schizophrenic in terms of how the West perceives them. Do we need to handle China? Yes, we do, but it's through diplomacy, in my view. James Cleverly was right to go to China. I thought that was an excellent trip, and I think we've got to work with China. So the idea that China is just bad and that we need to isolate them internationally, I don't agree with that at all. If you only deal with those that you may not like, we wouldn't be very influential on the world stage.
Thank you. Alistair?
And we wouldn't be dealing with many if we only worked with those that we liked. Very broadly, I agree with James. I should say, as a Foreign Office Minister whose experience of the sharp end of conflict was usually being taken extremely carefully by well-protected after conflicts were over, and never experiencing any danger. It's always a humbling experience to be on a panel with those who have really been on the sharp end because of foreign policy, and I do pay tribute to colleagues who have been very active in conflict zones. China. I'm Pro-Chancellor of Lancaster University. We have a campus in China, and we also have a Confucius Institute. We do a lot of high-grade research, so our relationship has been one of great care in that licenses are needed for some of our students to come over. There are things that they can work on, things that they can't work on. So I think the current phrase is to be clear-eyed about the state and what it does. But the world won't work unless there is engagement with China, and China knows this full well. Whether it's dealing with climate or whether it's dealing with the world's economy, disengaging China is just not possible. So engaging with it is extremely important. I also agreed that James Cleverly's visit was timely and important. And I know from experience, you go to these places, you go to places that aren't comfortable, and you do tell them what you really think, because you must do so. They don't always like it, and usually there are comebacks. But unless that work goes on, then life is difficult. I'm quite convinced that China's three main foreign policy aims are: number one, China; number two, China; number three, China. It is absolutely single-minded on reversing what it calls a century of humiliation, and it has not forgotten. We often look at the world as we think it has been. We remember the good bits. We tend not to remember the things that were difficult. Many countries around the world, they remember extremely well, and they're very, very determined, and the Chinese are very determined never ever to be in a supplicant position again. I'm not so sure on the military side. I think you lived in Taiwan, you might feel differently. I think that's an area of great caution, and the world must be very straightforward as to how it would view any potential military activity there to threaten Taiwan. But in broad sense, the box that China is in is one where its partnership will be necessary for a variety of things the world needs. Constant engagement will be important. There will be rocks along the way, and China will do things that will be very uncomfortable. But a disengagement is not practical. There's a big world out there. China is busy making a lot of other friends, and will be looking to use any sense of disengagement in order to tell other countries that's the British for you. If they don't like you, don't like what you do, then of course they'll disengage. We won't. We're your friend all the time. So we have to play it extremely carefully, be wary, but there is no world without engagement with China. And I think, as James has said, I think the government policy is about right at the moment.
Thank you. So Joe, I'll sort of come to you on the partnerships point, and I'd also be intrigued, Jay, to hear what you think on that relationship as well. But Joe.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Of course, I work for an NGO, I'm definitely going to say, more funding is needed. More funding is needed. MAG has just received, I think for the first time in 8 years, a small amount of funding from the FCDO for a small arms and light weapons or an arms control initiative in the Caribbean, which is very welcome, but it is a very small amount of funding, and it is the first time in 8 years, and compared to the amount of funding we receive for mine action, and the government is able to fund for mine action, it is concerning given the scale of the problem. But it's also not just about amount of funding, it's about how it's used. And I think the international community of the West has, on so many occasions now, sort of, on conflict, closed the barn door after the horse has bolted, whether that's Libya, whether it's Mali, it's over and over again, and it Burkina Faso, we saw the problem coming down the track, and no one took any action until full-on catastrophe. By then it's too late, and next we can see in that region the conflict encroaching on the Gulf of Guinea states, a couple of whom of course are also our Commonwealth partners. They are, asking for more weapons in preparation for a conflict that they know is coming. We need to build this accountability. We need to build their security sector actors up to actually be able to hold the governance that is essential when you have a kind of an insurgency coming across your border, and also to be able to control those arms that various different actors are going to be transferring to them. And again, it's not just the UK, but the UK could actually be taking a lead on this when really the international community is a long way behind. Similarly, the Caribbean, the needs are massive. We're starting to see in this country a growing quantity of US origin weapons arriving here, as opposed to from Europe, which has been the previous trend. And quite a lot of those will be coming through the Caribbean and the various European overseas territories, including our own, that are there. So it's also, as I say, about thinking about where the money goes, and that means not just thinking about situations of active armed conflict, but also other situations of violence like the Caribbean, like the not yet conflict affected countries in Africa, and of course again many of those are Commonwealth partners. It does also very much, any programming, any funding does really need to be connected to very, very clear and deliberate policy engagement in this area. The UK is doing pretty well on that, I would say, at the moment. There's been a definite increase in engagement in the arms control field from the FCDO. And actually it's not having funding that goes with that is letting down the actual, the sort of the soft power side of things. And I think definitely using that really privileged position that we have on the UN Security Council to actually, bring these issues really to the top of the agenda. And when you have a situation like Myanmar, for example, which risks destabilising the entire Asia Pacific region, the UK is the pen holder on the Security Council for that. So what can we be doing? And actually it comes back to the question that was asked before about China. We're not going to resolve that situation in Myanmar, which has been almost entirely forgotten about globally, without engagement with China, and that UN Security Council engagement on weapons issues is going to be really important.
Yes, so in terms of the question on, I think it's a really interesting question, what does the government need to do more on? Long gone are the days when we used to be able to deploy battalions and large formations into potential conflict zones or for stabilisation purposes. These days, it's smaller units, it's individual augmentees, it's individuals going into operational areas and theatres and working with our partners and allies. So I'll try answering that question in more of an operational sense, because I think there certainly is a lot more we can do based on what I said earlier in terms of the knowledge that we can bring to the fore with our subject matter experts. And I'm going to allude to the Commonwealth, but also our diaspora here in the UK as well, that we have such a rich, diverse country with so many natural points into our heritage and history and our past across multiple communities. And I often think, certainly within the British Army, I've seen this, when we're looking at conflict zones and areas, we very much have a rich foundation of people who we can deploy, who have that cultural expertise and that ability to understand audiences and be able to influence audiences as well. So operationally, I would like to see certainly more being invested in terms of behavioural change programs, certainly around dialogue and engagement, and effectively to get military-age males to not take up arms. It's something we did a lot of in Iraq in particular. And I think certainly with a lot of the areas where we see a lot of potential for conflict, certainly in parts of Africa, we have got the ability to understand from our own history and our own people here on these shores how to effectively communicate and message people to not take up arms and to engage in dialogue. The other part of the answer I would give is in terms of the development budget, I do want to see the incentivisation of the de-escalation elements. So looking at how we can use the development budget to de-escalate, to engage individuals and audiences, to take up dialogue and not, again, take up arms. But ultimately, we need effective strategies to counter threats early on. And the example I would use on that front is the rise of Russian PMCs in Africa, one famous one in particular, the Wagner Group. I personally think we were quite late to look at how we deal with them. But then again, we were working certainly with our partners to find out what the best way of dealing with these groups and organisations are. But by the time we've got effective strategies and we've got a mechanism moving and working to try countering some of these organisations, it's often too late. So I think we need to be ahead of the curve, and we can be ahead of the curve based on our knowledge base and our capabilities within the soft power area and the ability to influence.
Thank you. And I guess in a discussion around conflict, it'd be amiss of me not to mention Ukraine and Russia. And Joe, you kind of mentioned on this point, and I'd like to sort of ask it to James if I could. We sort of mentioned how conflicts and situations around the world can end up being forgotten and just become another conflict. James, how do you think we can ensure that Ukraine doesn't get forgotten or overlooked? Because it's not going to be a quick conflict, and we're already seeing cracks emerging in domestic support for Ukraine over in countries like the US, where it's becoming quite a contentious issue amongst the public, but also amongst lawmakers. Now, the UK has been a leader in galvanising support for Ukraine, especially encouraging the states to follow. How do you think we can maintain that coalition? And then, Alistair, I'd like to come to you and ask how we can build that coalition maintain that coalition outside of the US, especially with many Commonwealth nations who have actually remained quite impartial in, or remained quite distant from taking sides. But James, I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I mean, loads in there. At the sort of macro level, we've seen for many years how Russia has been engaging on the world stage. Crimea, flags at the poles, submarine warfare, incursions into UK airspace, the list goes on. And I think the West has been guilty, actually, for many years of not checking it in the way that we should. So the Ukraine has happened, the invasion's taken place, Putin has miscalculated. But he miscalculated because he felt that the West wouldn't necessarily block his intentions, and that's what's happened. So the simple answer is, do we need to continue with Ukraine? Yes. Do we need to keep supporting Ukraine? Yes. Why? Because if the Russians succeed in Ukraine, who's next? And what is next? I would say for the record, of course, that the Ukrainians are doing a very good job out there with their innovative approach to warfare. Yes, they're being very well supported right now by the West, by NATO in particular, but don't forget that right now NATO massively overmatches Russia in every respect. So just have a think about what is left in the locker right now. The West has given the Ukraine a lot of land-based equipment, a bit of ISTAR, the list goes on, without saying too much. But don't forget what's left waiting in the wings. And Putin knows full well that if he takes NATO on, there'll be a very high price to pay. So I suspect that the way that we keep maintaining momentum is through politicians like Ben Wallace and Grant Shapps and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, who has been utterly supportive since day one. It's about diplomacy. It's about the message being fully communicated and understood by NATO partners. I sit on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, which is effectively a body of NATO country politicians feeding political input, which ultimately ends up as operational output for NATO. NATO is the way forward. NATO's been given a real shot in the arm because of the Ukraine conflict. NATO is very relevant. It's the only show in town. Sorry, forget you four. NATO is the only show in town. and it's backed by the Americans, which is very important. So it's about maintaining friendships and relationships. It's about maintaining it in the public space. It's about journalists reporting from Ukraine. It's about the narrative, of course, that Ukrainian people are innocent victims of a pretty shocking attack on a sovereign neighbour. I'm pretty clear on this one. And again, British government policy is about right.
Thank you. Alistair, on the more global coalition argument.
I mean, all that James has said, I mean, don't neglect the fact that the United Nations General Assembly has overwhelmingly backed motions criticising Russia for its actions. Sure, not everyone has, but there's been overwhelming support and condemnation of Russia's activity. How do you keep the momentum up? It is essential that the conflict does not become a forgotten one. There is, of course, the argument that because it's taking place in Europe, our media sees it rather differently than it sees conflicts elsewhere. I think there's some truth in that. So the likelihood of Ukraine being forgotten is unlikely. But in terms of international coalitions, well, fighting to preserve people's freedom is a cost. And diplomacy is absolutely essential. Everyone's at risk if Russia wins. And I think British foreign policy to work with allies and partners to ensure that message stays very firmly in people's minds is really important. I suspect Russia was taken by surprise with the reaction. You can trace back perhaps to the decisions on Syria, where it became clear that the West was not going to intervene there, but Russia and Iran were. That there was no pushback in relation to that, no pushback in relation to Crimea, other decisions that perhaps encouraged Putin to think that the West had weakened, probably encouraged the seizure of Ukraine. That has come to a stop because of the reaction from the public. No artificial means was necessary to galvanise the British public to support the Ukrainian people, to offer them refuge, to offer them support, which goes on a daily basis. Most of us will know people who are on their way to Ukraine at the moment, carrying gifts and supplies and all the things that are necessary, as well as people sort of supporting people at home. It will be draining, it will take time, but it is just a necessity to keep the coalitions going. Diplomatically at world level, absolutely through NATO, G7, through some partners on the UN Security Council. That, of course, is its big weakness at the moment, the ability of veto for Russia and China. But it's quite clear that other methods can be used in order to deliver the coalition and keep it going. But I think the number one thing that should be kept in people's minds is, if Russia wins, who's next? And there's a whole series of states who know what the answer to that will be. And if there is any weakening, it would be a disaster. And I think the United Kingdom will absolutely play its part with other partners to make sure that message stays fixed in people's minds.
Thank you. I will now return to questions from the audience. Now I've had my indulgence there. Yes, if we could just go to this lady there, and then in the lady in the grey blazer, if we could, afterwards. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, thanks very much to the panel. My name's Susie Madigan and I'm the Senior Humanitarian Advisor at Care International. So given the global evidence demonstrating that when women and women-led organisations are involved in peace negotiations and conflict reduction efforts, that the chances of peace are more likely, and also sustainable peace more likely. What does the panel hope to see in regards to women and girls and women-led organisations in the upcoming aid white paper? And then just separately, perhaps if anyone has any thoughts about artificial intelligence and whether or not you think it's more likely to increase or decrease conflict, or perhaps reduce the likelihood or increase the likelihood of international humanitarian law violations. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm pretty sure we could have an entire panel just on the implications of AI alone in foreign policy. Yes.
Now, I promised that we didn't buddy up for this question, but it's going to be quite a similar one. My name's Donna Gavin. I'm ex-regular Army officer, but I now serve as a sexual violence and conflict advisor for the British Army. And so my question is, and I recognise, Alistair, in your opening remarks around gender being one of the biggest, one of the kind of core components to conflict. And we know that countries with less gender parity are more likely to be unstable. But I just get so frustrated that and after we kind of recognise the problem, it then just goes to a footnote. And we don't seem to be really tackling it meaningfully, or it doesn't really kind of drive any of the kind of high-level narrative. So what can we do to protect women in conflict zones, and why are we not doing more?
Excellent. I guess, Joe, if we'll come to you as the NGO on the group. No small selection of topics there. So do you want to kick us off maybe on the white paper and women and girls in conflict prevention, and then I'd be intrigued to come to maybe Jay on the AI points. And likewise, James, if you have any insights into that one as well. But there are quite some meaty topics that have just come up there.
Yeah, I mean, yes, okay, thank you. I mean, if I may, I'm probably going to say a bit on the gender part, and then also something on the AI bit, if that's okay, because I do think that possibly some of the couple of the elements of the questions there were perhaps more for government colleagues on the panel to answer, because I can't tell you what's going to be in the white paper, whereas perhaps others on the panel can. I mean, certainly from Mag's perspective, including gender aspects in everything we do is obviously really, really critical. And I think, particularly given the nature of the type of work that we're talking about today, that is engaging with security forces in the types of countries that we're talking about. And as a side note, it's definitely fair to say that when dealing with the security forces in, for example, the Caribbean, you see, almost a 50% representation, whereas in a lot of parts of Africa, it's absolutely minimal. And I think that there is a lot that we can do, and that we are starting to do in terms of using the quite technical work that we do as it's a really good entry point and kind of confidence building measure to be able to have conversations about things like the women, peace and security agenda. And to be kind of gently and gradually advocating on kind of more meaningful participation of women and engagement with civil society. It is a slow process for sure, and it definitely it needs more partnerships. Because we do one particular type of work, we need to be working more with others. We need greater government support, not just from the UK, but across the board in order to be able to do that. And the rest of the gender-related questions, I'm gonna palm off to others. But I think also just on the question about artificial intelligence, the lethal autonomous weapon systems debate is kind of the next big humanitarian disarmament debate, if you like. So we have been following it, and I think it's very clear that artificial intelligence does offer so many opportunities for good. That's absolutely, there's no question of that. But there's also so much risk of particularly in the weapons sphere of enormous violations of IHL, because if you don't have meaningful human human decision making, then how can there be any accountability? How can there be any kind of adherence to IHL and all the problems around bias in programming in the first place? There's an enormous amount of risk and concern there, and I think therefore the need for this issue to be picked up again, whether it's within the CCW forum or outside of it, it needs to happen, because it's been stalled for too long.
Thank you. James, if you'd like to come in on maybe the point around women and girls in conflict, maybe as a government member of Parliament on the panel.
One of the things that motivates any politician is the need to stay out of the shit, okay? And the need to be off the headlines and to do your job. That's what motivates me as an MP. And 27 years in the army, man of duty, and all that. So I want to offer a very candid view about women, if I can. It will find favour with some, not with everyone. I came through Sandhurst in '93. I was part of the first ever common commissioning course, where we had women and men completely embedded for the first time ever in the same platoons working together. And you know what? No difference whatsoever. I spent 27 years in the RLC, which, as Donna knows and Jay knows, is a corps that proudly recruits male, female, gay, straight, black, white. Fantastic corps, gets diversity. And I commanded 27 Regiment, which is today the most diverse and largest regiment of the British Army. It's not an issue. It is just not an issue. And I think that success will be derived at the point at which we stop having these discussions. So to be very candid, I think that organisations with women at the helm and that have women embedded through the organisation tend to be more successful. And I say that because I think men are guilty in many ways of the bravado element. I think there's a little bit gung-ho. I think we've seen in the past worldwide where organisations, countries that have female politicians all the way through are very successful. We've had fantastic female leaders, multiple countries over the years, and I welcome more. So my personal view is that actually it is an issue, but it shouldn't be an issue. And Sarah Atherton, those who know Sarah, good friend of mine, did some great work recently with the Defence Select Committee on that paper that she wrote. It has brought issues to light. So to answer the question directly, I think that I'd welcome more women everywhere across all organisations. We've got to get the balance right. We've got to get more units led by women in the British Army. We're seeing women coming through now. General Sharon Nesmith springs to mind, and I think we're a much better army, as I proved myself at 27th Regiment, where we had a very high percentage of BME in females in that unit. It worked brilliantly. It was a very good organisation to command. So yes, is the simple answer. I agree with you, but let's not over-egg it, because ultimately you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force the horse to drink.
Jay, if I can then come to you a bit more on the sort of AI and conflict prevention then.
Yeah, of course, Ryan. Before I do, actually, just an interesting point I wanted to make an observation more about the first question from Susie in terms of women in conflict. And I think James made some absolutely valid points. What I would add to that is it's also very important to teach senior military leadership about the issues, and I base that on being involved with the fantastic gender advisory course which the British Army run. I was involved with in Kazakhstan of all places, and it had a number of representatives from a number of stands, a number of countries in the region. And I think kind of from that sort of perspective, I think we can certainly do a lot more with teaching senior leaders within nations that we work with or we're creating partnerships with, or are indeed interested in this issue. In Kazakhstan at the time, a few years ago, was interested in doing more on the UN stage, just about the importance of these issues, but also what to look out for, but also how to ensure that we're keeping women and young girls safe within conflict zones and areas that are becoming destabilised. Turning to AI and your question, can it increase or decrease conflict? Well, the truth is it can do both. It's a tool for both. Where the UK has a role, and I think it has a very important role, again alluding to what I said earlier in terms of our knowledge base, is about getting ahead of the curve and growing our own expertise. And we certainly need to be investing in that. I'm a big proponent and advocate of Rishi Sunak's policy in terms of investing more in our young children having more math skills and science in particular. Coding is very important. And if we can invest in that and grow our expertise, then we can ensure that it is a tool for good. Otherwise, what we face is a world where any malign actor will certainly want to utilise AI for their own nefarious purposes, and we can't allow that to go unchecked. So I think in answer to your question on that, it can be both, but we need to ensure that we are using it as a tool for good to alleviate and mitigate conflict as and wherever possible.
Let me say a brief word about the other aspect of women's engagement, and that is in political leadership in conflict areas and the resolution and peace talks. You're absolutely right. All the evidence points to the fact that where women are involved in negotiating the end of conflict, and above all, building from that, because as we know, there's too many places where the cause of conflict is the end of the previous conflict because the issues aren't dealt with. Studies in Latin America have tended to demonstrate that women's engagement is of huge importance in building up a state afterwards and making sure that the corruption and poor governance that were often key components of the breakdown in governance in the first place don't reoccur. So I think that's really important. It is difficult. I think the UK's example is of huge importance, but there are plenty of places where women's role in society just is not recognised the same way. I went to the peace conference in Palermo 2018 as Libya dragged on, met the Libyan delegation, and there was a Libyan delegation of women from various cities who'd come together, who were working with us, and they came to the conference, and at the conference table they weren't to be seen because the Libyan men had relegated them. They weren't going to sit with the men. They were somewhere separate, and I went deliberately to see them in order to talk to them, to try and give some sense to the fairly inept Libyan politicians who have been largely responsible for the prolongation of that conflict, to demonstrate that we took women's participation very seriously. So the example of the UK is important. There are some societies in which it is just genuinely very difficult to achieve, and we must continue to work on them. And I think we need to continue to put the resources into it. And it's not a footnote. I worked with Mark Bryce and Richardson on the creation of the stabilisation policy post 2016, a long project. Women were a key part of that, and I'm quite sure present day advocates of the stabilisation and conflict policy in the FCDO still adhere to that and still work on it. So it's important that the case is continually made.
Thank you. We've got about time for one more question before I ask the panel for their closing remarks. If I could just, I think, go to the woman right at the back, if I could. Her hand was very quick up, so if you could just ask your what the final sort of brief question, if you could.
Yeah, Megan Rowland Daverill from Tier Fund. I was just wondering if the panellists could share their thoughts on sort of building a little bit on talking about women, but also on engagement with local NGOs, particularly with local faith actors and the role that they can play in peace building and preventing conflict. I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts.
Alistair and Joe, if you'd like to come in on that, if that's okay.
Faith actors first. In some places, it's only the faith community that actually has a structure. And a distribution of aid and support done through faith actors is terribly important, because as we've all said, if the state collapses or if the state is not delivering in certain areas, somebody steps into the breach, and they're either malign actors or they're better actors, and I think we recognise that, and we work with those who we know have got good networks, good reputations, and can earn the trust and confidence of people. I mean, I cannot say too often the despair that I felt around the region that I spent so much time in, where people just deserve better from their governments, and they don't get it. And I'm sorry to be very basic about it, it's usually because it suits the people who are driving the conflict to keep it going. And I use Yemen as an example, and there are other places as well. And it's despairing to see people's needs neglected by those who claim to be acting in their interests for their country. And I've got very little time for some of those malevolent actors. But we have to keep working with everyone, and where we can work with the NGOs in delivery, I know we do, and it's very important to do so. It's very important they have credibility, and they do take risks. No aid worker should be a target, and in some places they are, and I think our forces and those who are engaged in protecting them know that extremely well.
Joe, if I'd come to you on that point as well.
Sure. Local NGOs on so many levels are, I think Jay mentioned earlier about the need for more operations that kind of support dialogue building. And coming back to the point that I made earlier about the need for security sector actors to be trusted by the population, local civil society, local NGOs are a really, really essential interface for that. They're also really, I think we all should recognise by now that the days of international NGOs kind of going into really, really complex environments that they don't fully understand and kind of bypassing all of those kind of local community structures. I hope that they are long gone, and I certainly hope that the UK, when it is looking at its peace building and conflict prevention programming, ensures that approach is kind of mainstreamed, within its requirements for any program design. I think. I could talk about this for ages, we don't have time. I think one aspect that is really, really important and continually neglected is the fact that actually bringing local actors into the international policy space is really, really important. You know, we talked about the importance of diplomacy. You know, for us, the international policy dialogue always links to what is happening on the ground. But those discussions are so rarely inclusive because the resources are just not there to ensure that local or even quite a lot of national actors are there as part of the dialogue, and therefore the international policy dialogue just really doesn't reflect actually what the needs are of people on the ground. So again, I mean, in terms of actually specific actions that the UK can take, I think, you know, looking at how to sponsor local actors to kind of be more involved in those kinds of processes is really critical.
Thank you. And so I'd just like to sort of come to our panellists' sort of closing remarks and sort of final thoughts on what is such a, as I said at the start, a timely and important discussion. And so I guess if I could just go, starting with Jay, what your kind of overall reflections are on the discussion we've had today, and also on the importance for the UK, I guess, to continue or in some cases even step up leadership on the world stage in terms of conflict and prevention.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a fascinating subject, and I wish we had more time because, as you've, as a fantastic audience, have taken it into so many areas that need a lot more light and a lot more discussion on. What I would say is, from my perspective, the UK has a very positive and pragmatic role to play on the world stage. That is based on our history, the lessons we've learnt in the past, and dare I say, from empire and the period where we were the superpower in the world and projecting that influence all over the globe. We shouldn't shy away from that. We need to learn from our history, warts and all, but we also need to learn the lessons and apply them in the more modern world that we live in, which is certainly a lot more dangerous. We're at constant competition with our with a number of malign actors as well as competitors. And we need to be bolder and more productive on the world stage in ensuring that we are able to apply our abilities and capabilities across soft power and within influence. I often think of the UK as potentially being a communication superpower. We're a member of the Five Eyes community, a very important player there. We've got very important strategic partnerships with not just the States but other regional allies as well, including India. And certainly what we need to be projecting forward into the future is the ability to achieve strategic effects. And that we can do not in isolation but in partnership with others. So let's be more positive and pragmatic about the UK's role and certainly ensure that we continue to play the role that the very important role that we have on the world stage.
Thank you. And I should have said before Jay started talking, in 30 seconds, please. Otherwise, I'm going to start getting some glares from Rosie, and I do not want that. So, Alistair, if I could come to you.
We remain trusted and needed. Secondly, how we convey our influence is different to how it was in the past, but it's still vital we do so. Soft power is key, education, media, all the things that we can convey. But it needs backed up, thirdly, and the resources that we have to put into hard power situations, demonstrated through NATO, has been a salutary lesson for those who believe it can all be done a different way. We have skills and abilities there. And fourthly, we should be proud of our situation. We don't need to be isolationists. We don't need to turn in on ourselves. It's a big world, it's a dangerous world, but it needs the United Kingdom to play its full part. And we've got good people who can do that in all different areas of foreign policy and commitment, and we should back them up and make sure that we have governments that know what our power can be, how to use it, how to work effectively with others, and never ever give up on the needs of people who actually do depend on someone shining a light for a better system of governance and more opportunity for them.
James?
Very briefly, I've known Jay for a while. He's annoyingly bright. Okay, he's a very precocious young man. I love him to bits. I don't know Alistair quite so well, but both have spoken a lot of sense today, and I agree with both of the remarks in terms of summing up. I'd add one thing. Back in about 98, 99, Tony Blair did the Chicago speech, which, for those of you who haven't read it, you need to. It's an extraordinary exposition of his case for intervening in conflicts. It was very clever at the time and resonates, I think, today. We need something similar now. And my view is that I could do with reading a strategy. You know, what is our strategy globally? What does the UK want to do globally? You know, what does this mean? the Coalition for Global Prosperity. What is the UK role in that? So I want to see an international strategy and dialogue in terms of where we see ourselves plugging in the year 2023. And in terms of the conflict business, I think the need for and the case for ethical foreign policy and ethical intervention in conflict is also really important. We're pretty good at that. NATO, of course, wouldn't allow us now autonomously to do anything that was contrary to those principles and those beliefs. We are a bastion of the free world. But I want to see something on paper now in terms of articulation of how we do it.
Don't wait for it, James. Write it.
I'm not clever enough.
Oh, go on.
Joe, if I could come to you for the final, very brief word.
I'm going to make it 20 seconds just to compensate for all the non-30 seconds. All of which I, agree with very much. I think I would just say that, as I said kind of quite early on, that, the international community is not doing well at conflict prevention really at the moment, and there is definitely a need for a state or a group of states to step more consciously into that gap, and I think that is a role that the UK can and should be playing, given everything that's just been said by the other panellists.
Beautifully done.
Well
Thank
done.
you very much.
Well done.
And so if we can just give a round of applause to our panel, please. Thank you all for joining us.